We ended with a light cliffhanger last week. We have a complicated God-fearing family that we're examining in chapter 1. They've gone up to worship Yahweh in a place called Shiloh. And when you hear me say Yahweh or Jehovah today, remember those were the names of God. Yahweh is the official name. Jehovah's okay, but it's secondary to Yahweh. Yahweh is the correct way. Jehovah was like a version of that. Today, Shiloh is in the West Bank. If you're like, well, that means nothing to me. I know where Jerusalem is. Find that in your mental map and then go about 26 miles north, if that helps. That's where Shiloh is. That's where they're at right now. They went there because the tabernacle was there. They went there because that's where the presence of God would have been with the ark, but it's complicated, right, with the ark too. We'll come back to that in a few weeks as far as what's the ark, where is it, what's going on with it. But this family, they've traveled to make offerings before the Lord. They're there to worship. They're either making a peace offering or thanksgiving offering. We know that because, well, they're partaking of it. They're at the tabernacle. They're sharing in this meal together. It's supposed to be a beautiful thing. It's supposed to be a time of worship, of joy. Elkanah, he passes out. He's the head of the household. It's a messy household, but he's the head of it, and he's passing out portions to his family. He gave a double portion to sweet Hannah. Our sweet Hannah was given a double portion of this offering, but she's not enjoying it. When we last left her, she was weeping bitterly. Verse 7 is where we left off. It says, "So it went on year by year, as often as she went up to the house of the Lord, Peninnah used to provoke her. Therefore Hannah wept and would not eat." So she's not only crying because of her circumstances, right? Being childless, barren, that would have been bad enough all by itself. But on top of that, her husband has another wife, Peninnah. And this second wife is ridiculing her constantly and didn't even stop when they were at church, basically. I gave him kids, you didn't. Like, whoa, that's gross. We said that's gross, but she's doing this. Why? Because she's hurting too. She's jealous, and she's hurting that Elkanah loves Hannah more. How do we know that? Because he has no problem showing everyone, 2 portions for you, boo. You know, and she's like, I gave you kids, and I'm chopped liver. That's how Peninnah felt. Now, we're not going to rehash the issue of polygamy. It's an important question, but it's one that we talked a lot about. If you have questions, reference previous studies, ask me after the service. I'd love to chat about it, but we won't. We could talk all day about that issue. Suffice it to say, we got drama here. And that's one of the things I love about the scriptures, right? Not the drama necessarily. That's kind of gross too, but I mean, I'd be lying if I said I didn't. But the fact that it's real, that the scriptures are real. We got real people living in a real world dealing with real issues. And God doesn't hold back. Now, I'm not a huge fan of Westerns. If you are, I'm sorry, I'm just not. There's a few that maybe I could try to get through, but there's one that I really like the name of it. She's like, have you ever seen it? Nope, but the name is cool. It's called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly.
I knew he was.
Yeah, Clint Eastwood, I know he's in it, and it's got a cool name. That's all I know. I love the name, though, because it makes me think of the Bible. And you're like, what, a rated R Western? You sinner? No, I mean, because when I think of the Bible, I think of the good, I think of the bad, and I think of the ugly that he just lays out on display for us to learn from. Paul told the Corinthians, these have been written for your example. God doesn't just want you to learn everything the hard way, experientially. He wants you to be able to learn from the mistakes of others, including those who've gone before us in the faith. If solely written by man to persuade men, this book would not include as much of the ugly as it does. So much of the negative stuff about human beings, about these families, right? This family and dozens of other families are not shown in the greatest light, are they? If man had written this book like the Mormon book, like the Quran, the book of the Muslims, it would have encouraged Elkanah's foolish behavior. Yeah, have multiple wives. Like Muhammad, God told me it's okay. Just like Moroni told Joseph Smith, it's okay to have a bunch of wives. The Bible doesn't do that. The Bible doesn't condone such behavior. But carnal books, demonic books do. I'm honestly shocked that there are any Mormon or Muslim women at all. It shocks me to my core that any Mormon or Muslim women exist. Polygamous culture. I know all the ladies here that are like, oh yeah, polygamy? No, sir. Not okay with it. But you see, so many are born into and raised in that darkness. My heart breaks for them because it's like we get to see in the Old Testament, it doesn't go well. It doesn't go well in modern time either. But because the true author and compiler of the Bible is God, it reveals the good, the bad, and the ugly of people in general, of the Jewish people. God's concerned with truth. So God gives us the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So thank you, God. The truth is, real people are real messy. And we see real people in the Scriptures. And they're messy. They're messed up. One other thought that many Christians have a tendency to think is that the world is more messed up now than it's ever been. Be false. I don't think it is. Now, I will concede that technology has made it easier for us to sin. Perhaps one could argue it has increased our ability to harm ourselves, to harm others, but that's only because those propensities, those twisted desires are already in there. And they've already been in there. They've been there since we got kicked out of the garden. So in the Word, the real God reveals himself through real people who had real problems. You're going to hear me emphasize that a lot on our journey through the book of Samuel. Remember, it was one book previously, and they busted it into two. This morning, here's some realness. Elkanah finds out Hannah is weeping bitterly. And rather than come to the rescue, he doesn't just put his foot in his mouth, he puts a foot locker in there. And no, not the metal box, but the shoe store. Like he has an entire shoe store in his mouth. We said last week, we got to be careful with our words when we attempt to counsel people through life's troubles and problems and pains. And Elkanah is going to do the exact opposite. He won't be alone with suffering from foot-and-mouth-itis today. There will be two. This morning we'll be introduced to another key figure in the book of Samuel whose words will make Hannah feel even worse. And he was mentioned in verse 3. His name is Eli. He's the high priest. His feet won't only be in his mouth, he will be using his feet to make another rookie mistake, and that is jumping to conclusions. If jumping to conclusions was a thing, Eli would have his own shoe, kind of like Michael Jordan. Like, the Jumpman symbol, that's Eli. He's jumping to conclusions in our study. I got to be careful I don't split my pants, right? So he's going to jump to conclusions so bad it's going to look like he's flying. Some observations I've made over 20 years is that we have a tendency to do this a lot. We jump to conclusions too. We put our foot in our mouth too. We get saved, and in our youthful zeal at first, we want to go solve everyone's problems. I just met Jesus, the problem solver. I'm going to solve everyone's problems. No, you're not. No, you're not. We have a genuine desire to be helpful when we first get saved. And again, Jesus answered our biggest problem, our sin problem, but that doesn't make us suddenly experts for everybody. And even as we give Jesus, sometimes we do so in our youthful zeal, a little arrogantly, not thinking about how difficult it might be for the person we're sharing with. Sadly, we can fall back into that trap, jumping to conclusions and being inconsiderate once you've been in ministry for a long time or you've been walking with the Lord for a long time. As a pastor, or maybe not everyone here is a pastor, right? But even a leader in the body of Christ, a seasoned Christian, you see a lot of the same things, right? You answer a lot of the same questions, you deal with a lot of the same issues, so you get a little careless. And we got to be careful not to jump into autopilot and therefore jumping to conclusions. The Lord has reminded me many times, James 1:9, listen more, speak less, right? Be quick to listen, slow to speak. We can get things wrong when we automatically assume we know everything about a person or their situation, and we can oftentimes do more harm than good. What's the answer? What do we do? Again, well, James 1:9 helps us a little. Slow to speak, quick to listen. But Jesus' model is also brilliant. Shouldn't surprise us, right? He's brilliant. Not that God needed to gather intel. He didn't need to gather information. But what did Jesus do in all of his interactions with other people? He asked questions. He asked questions to know more. He'd even question his questioners to get more information or to show them something as well. So let's not bury the lead any further. Let's jump into our text, picking up in verse 8, reading to verse 18. That's where we're going to be today. It says, and Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? And why do you not eat? And why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons? Oh gosh, that's so cringe just reading. After they had eaten and drunk in Shiloh, Hannah rose. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord, and she wept bitterly. And she vowed a vow, saying, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head. And she continued praying before the Lord. Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was speaking in her heart. Only her lips moved and her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli took her to be a drunken woman. And Eli said to her, How long will you go on being drunk? Put your wine away from you. But Hannah answered, No, my Lord, I'm a woman troubled in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink. But I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for all along I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation. Then Eli answered, Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition that you have made to him. And she said, Let your servant find favor in your eyes. Then the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. Lot to unpack there, starting with the genius remarks made by Elkanah to his hurting wife. I read from the ESV because that's where I teach from, but when we revisit, I'll read from the NLT because I like both. NLT is a little more modern vernacular, modern way of talking. Why are you crying, verse 8? Why are you crying, Hannah? Elkanah asked. Why aren't you eating? Why be downhearted just because you have no children? You have me. Is that not better than 10 sons? Prince Charming over here to the rescue. After I read some of the dumb stuff that these men say to Hannah, I conclude Hannah is one of the godliest women in the universe, in all the Bible. I don't think any of us would judge her if the next verse said, and Hannah punched Elkanah in the throat. Good thing she didn't, right? Because that would be dishonoring to the Lord, right? But I'm looking for a verse that says throat chops are okay. I still haven't found it yet, but thankfully she didn't do this. But I don't think we could blame her if she had. With lines like this, it's a wonder that Elkanah was able to get one wife, and he's got 2. But guess what? He's a real guy, and real guys say some real dumb stuff sometimes, don't we? Don't answer that.
I'm sipping my coffee.
Right? I know a pastor says, if you can't say amen, say ouch. So ouch, He didn't attempt to even comfort her. If you look at it closely, he's not only is it ignorant, he's not actually comforting her at all. He's actually getting his feelings hurt that she's sad. What are you crying? Am I not enough for you? Now, I've been pretty hard on Elkanah this morning. I'll lighten up for a little bit. All of us at one time or another have said the wrong thing at the wrong time. Sadly, it might have even been rooted in selfishness, just like Elkanah. On a real application note, husbands, my dear brothers, may we be so careful and cautious with the words we say to our wives. She is the second most important person in your life after Jesus. He commands us to love our wives in Ephesians 5 the same way as he loved his church. What did he do for his church? Lay down his life for his bride. One of the things we can do in laying our lives down for our brides is not make everything about us. We can often be like Elkanah. I've been there, and I am so sorry for those times where it's like, You hear one thing, it goes in your ear as one thing, but your guy brain gets in the way and you understand it totally different. It happens. Elkanah is a real guy. And when our wives are sometimes sharing their difficulties with us, difficulties they're facing, sometimes we take offense as though they're saying that there's something that we are lacking or that we aren't doing. And we take it the wrong way because their brains work different than our brains. And just being aware of that can save you a lot of strife. The Bible says don't be quick to take offense. It may not and probably isn't about you at all. Now, wives, hopefully you don't blame your husband for every bad thing that happens either. Especially if it's something that he clearly has no control over. Elkanah cannot make her have a baby. He can do the legwork, but he can't make the magic happen once it's in here, right? They can do the act, but he can't make the act fruitful. Only God can do that. He has no control over the seed after the fact. Enough said, right? Elkanah has no power or control over whether or not Hannah can conceive. May we have realistic expectations of our spouses. May we not walk in offense and assume that every time they're going through something that it's our fault or they're communicating to us is blaming us for something. Fellas, sometimes they just need someone to listen. Sometimes, guys, we want to fix it. Sometimes they don't want you to fix it. They just want you to listen. One final thought, husbands and wives. Your spouse has needs that you can't fulfill. This is not me putting you down or saying you are deficient. It's not a flaw. It's by design. Your spouse is not your all in all. God is. Your spouse is a blessing from God and may enrich your life, but they are incapable of satisfying the longing of your soul. There are things that your spouse needs that you can't give, that they can only get from God. To a lesser degree, your spouse also needs friends of the same sex that are going to understand them and relate to them in ways that you can't. I used to feel like I was deficient in some way as my wife would share certain things with me, and I realized, like, man, you're a horrible woman. Me, I make a horrible woman. That's why I don't understand some things. That's why I can't relate. So I'll be like, go call Lucy or Leanne or Beth, or call your mom, because I don't understand, and I don't want to put my foot in my mouth or a foot locker. God made men and women distinctly different. I'm clearly not a woman. Never will be, never can be, because men can't be women. But I'm not a woman, so I can't relate to all the challenges that come from being a woman. I'm grateful that the Lord has brought along women into our lives that can be there for my wife as sisters in the Lord. And the inverse, also true. My wife is not a man. Thank God. She's my best friend on this side of heaven, but she can't fully relate to what it means to be a man. So I need like-minded brothers in the Lord to pray for me and help me with the struggles that come from trying to be a godly man in an ungodly world. Now, moving on. Hannah patiently endures her husband's foolishness, but it seems shortly thereafter, she gets up, she's frustrated, she gets up, she walks away. Also a smart thing to do sometimes. But Superman number 2 comes to add to her strife, right? Verse 9 to 11. The sacrificial meal at Shiloh, or after the sacrificial meal at Shiloh, Hannah got up and went to pray. Eli, the priest, was sitting at his customary place beside the entrance of the tabernacle. Hannah was in deep anguish, crying bitterly as she prayed to the Lord. And she made this vow, O Lord of hosts, if you will look upon my sorrow and answer my prayer and give me a son, then I will give him back to you. He will be yours for his entire lifetime. And as a sign that he has been dedicated to the Lord, his hair will never be cut. So Hannah, such a saint, right? Doing the right thing. She removed herself from the situation and says, I'm going to go pray. Hannah went to the house of the Lord to go pray. Well, they're already at the house of the Lord, but they went out, they're eating, and she's like, nope, need to go back in, need to pray. She went to the Lord with her problems and with her pain. She's got a lot of problems that she's dealing with, if you haven't noticed. Her husband was divided with 2 wives. Her home is a place of constant strife. Your home is supposed to be a place of refuge. When she's at home, she's got to deal with Peninnah constantly berating her. Her hope had been disappointed. Every Jewish woman wanted to be a mother. She was misunderstood by her husband, and he says genius things like, what, aren't I as good as 10 sons, babe? No. And rather than listening to her and comforting her, he takes it personal. He makes it about himself. Hannah is going through hell right now. Despite all this, Hannah's doing the right things. She's doing 3 things, actually, in verses 10 and 11. We see 3 things that she's doing. She wept, she prayed, she committed the whole situation to the Lord. She wept, she prayed, she committed the circumstances to the Lord. Some think, well, what crying is doing something? Oh, yes it is. Yes it is. especially if you're directing those cries to God, but even just crying in general. Sometimes, and ladies probably more than guys, but guys, I don't know about you, but there have been points in my life to where I am done and and sometimes that release valve of I can't hold it in anymore, God. And you weep. And it's cathartic. It's therapeutic, right? She wept. She prayed. She's talking to God, the only one that can do anything about her situation. But not just a prayer, not just a venting session, but also handing it over to the Lord. Because sometimes we can pray with closed hands, and I'm saying that tongue in cheek, right? Of course, because this is like the traditional image of prayer, right? Like this or like this. But Hannah, it's like she's praying like this, right? I'm handing this over to you. I'm committing it to you because it's too big for me. I can't do anything about this. I love what she calls God. She cries out to the Lord of hosts. Some of your translations may say the Lord Almighty, but the Lord of hosts is more accurate. Yahweh Sabaoth or Jehovah Sabaoth. Remember, Yahweh, Jehovah, same thing. This name of God, the Lord of hosts, is used over 260 times in the Old Testament. And it literally translates to the Lord of heaven's armies. And it's kind of strange, right? You might think it's strange, like, why is she crying out to him as the Lord of heaven's armies? Because she's at war in her life. She's at war in her home. She's at war in her mind. So she needs the Lord of heaven's armies to fight those wars that she's losing or that she feels like she's going to lose. I also love that she uses this title for the Lord because Hannah right now, again, she's being attacked from every side. So what does she do? Cries out to the Lord Almighty, the Lord of heaven's armies, the Lord of hosts, Jehovah Sabaoth. She needs him to fight the battles that are too big for her. We too should do the same in our time of need and our time of adversity. He is still Jehovah Sabaoth. Now I'm grateful that the Word of God reveals that He is Jehovah Sabaoth, the Lord of hosts that will fight for me. But I'm also grateful that the Word reveals that He is also Jehovah Rapha, the God who heals. Because sometimes I feel beat down from the fight that I'm in, and I need His healing touch as well. And He's both of those things. It's always a fun study. If maybe you did it a long time ago, early in your walk, but you haven't done it again, do it again. And that is looking at the names of God throughout the Bible. I used to have this poster, and I think every brand new convert in the early 2000s had this poster. And it was from Walmart, and it had all the names of God on it, and it was so cool. And I wish I still had it. I'm sure I can find it. Maybe after this I'll look for it. But it had all the names of God, and it had scripture references as to where they're used. He has all these titles, and it's so cool to be reminded that every one of those titles is another reminder of a way He wants to show up in my life. He's fighting for you as the Lord of heaven's armies, but He's bandaging you up when you feel worn out from the fight, as well as your healer. Hannah is using this name for God to highlight also His power. He who has the power to control the legions of heaven has more than enough power to deal with the trials that my life is sending my way. If you think of earth as one realm and heaven as another realm, well, if He runs the higher realm, the implication is that the lower realm is no problem, right? I was thinking of this study like, well, it's like my wife's job, and you're like, what? Heaven and earth realm are like Aaron? Well, it's like you got the store manager and the account manager, and it's like, well, but she's the store manager, right? So it's and the Karen, she understands this theology, right? Because she wants to talk to the store manager and not. No. Anyways, the implication being, if you talk to the store manager, they supersede the other managers, right? Well, He is the God of heaven's armies. He is in control of what's happening in the heavenlies. He's more than enough capable to handle the ones going on in our world, in our realm. He who commands the legions of divine beings in the heavenlies is so powerful that He can also control the events of your life to bring about His will and to create His image in you. What else does Hannah say as she cries out to God? In her crying out to God, she makes a vow. She makes a vow as a promise. She makes a promise to God. Now, this is not uncommon, right? When times get hard, all kinds of people cry out to God, and all kinds of people make promises to God. Not everyone keeps them, though. Hard times have a tendency to drive us to our knees, and that's partly, spoiler alert, why they are allowed That's partly why they're designed and allowed into our lives, is so that it reminds us that He's God and we are not. But if you make those promises to God, keep those promises. We got to keep the promises we make to God, and we got to keep the promises we make before God. Scripture is adamant about not making empty promises to God. Deuteronomy 23, 21 through 23 says, "When you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay in fulfilling it. For the Lord your God will surely require it of you, and you will be guilty of sin. But if you refrain from vowing, you will not be guilty of sin. You shall be careful to do what is passed from your lips. For you have voluntarily vowed to the Lord your God, which you have promised with your mouth." So if you're going to promise it to the Lord, you need to do it, or else don't do it and get yourself into trouble. Ecclesiastes 5, 4 and 5. "When you vow a vow to God, do not delay paying it, for He has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you vow. It is better that you should not vow than that you should vow and not pay." God expects you to do what you say to Him. If you committed to doing something before the Lord, you have to keep that promise. Numbers 30:20. "If a man vows a vow to the Lord or swears an oath to bind himself by a pledge, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth." And one more for good measure, Psalm 50, verse 14. "Offer to God a sacrifice of thanksgiving and perform your vows to the Most High." If you're going to offer it, follow through, perform it. Allow adversity to drive you to your knees, to the feet of Jesus. But be sure that if you make any promises to God in the midst of, "Oh God, if you do this for me, I'll do that," if that's where you find yourself, be sure that you're sincere when you come to His feet. And if you do make any of those promises, Hannah's about to make a promise to God, and time will reveal whether or not she keeps that promise. Now, what is she asking for? She asks for a son. And what is she promising in return? Well, she promises, "I'm going to give that son to you, Lord, for your work, for your service." She says, "Lord of hosts, if you give me a son, I'm going to dedicate him to serving you." And it's a specific vow. If there's a subtle thing in the end there that lets us know what vow she's referring to. She is vowing that her son will be a Nazirite from birth. There's one other famous Nazirite that you think of first. You didn't know Samuel was a Nazirite, but he was. Who's the famous one? Well, he's the big buff guy he's Samson, right? But she says, "I'm going to give him back to you. He'll be yours for his lifetime. And as a sign that I've dedicated him to you, his hair will never be cut." Where does that come from? Where does the Nazirite vow come from? It comes from the law. It comes from Numbers chapter 6. And we're not going to go there for the interest of time, but there we find out that the Nazirite vow included a few things. A Nazirite was to refrain from partaking of the product from the grapevine. This was an outward symbol of separating oneself from the desires of the flesh. They also were to take no part in mourning for the dead. Not just could they not have contact with the dead, but even mourning for the dead. They weren't to come near a dead body, mourn a dead body. Under the law of Moses, contact with the dead made one ceremonially unclean. And this unique vow took that ceremonial cleanliness to a whole other level, as death highlights the corruption of sin and the fruit of sin. In addition to that, the Nazirite was to have greater concerns. They weren't to be distracted with the cares of life, the common ups and downs typical of the human condition. And the last part we'll touch on is one that we're, of course, all familiar with because of Samson. And it's the one that Hannah mentions here, and it has to do with what I don't have, with hair. One under a Nazirite vow was not to cut their hair. One under this vow from birth apparently was never to cut their hair, it seems. And he said, well, why? Well, this was the outward symbol of this unique commitment that they were making. It was public. It was visible to all who were in the community that I have made this vow, and it was a visual reminder to everyone in their community that vow was made. Kind of accountability. Now, according to most theologians, the vow of a Nazirite was taken for a set period of time. It was usually temporary. It was temporal. This strikes us as odd because the two most common examples are, again, Samson and Samuel. And both of them are dedicated from birth with this vow. But that doesn't mean no one else ever took it. It's built into Numbers. But these guys, they're unique. They were dedicated as Nazarites from birth. Therefore, the commitment was a lifelong commitment to God. There are several similarities between Samson and Samuel, but faithfulness to the Lord will be, of course, the distinguishing factor. If you know anything about their life stories, Samson is famous, sadly, for his failure. Some have wondered why Hannah would have promised her son with this strange vow. If Hannah had a child, the child was going to be born automatically a Levite. We know that from 1 Chronicles chapter 6 lets us know that Elkanah was a part of the tribe of Levi. So he was already going to be a Levite. This would have meant he's kind of already dedicated to the Lord. But she wanted to go above and beyond. The Nazarite vow was a way of dedicating her son above and beyond. That's what makes this so significant. Also, even being a Levite, the time of a Levite's unique dedication was also for a certain time period. But this was going to be for life. Again, Hannah is going above and beyond to differentiate her unique promise, her unique offering to the Lord. Hannah's taking something that technically already belongs to the Lord, acknowledges that, but then says, I'm going to give it to you in an even greater sense. Now, David, who we're going to get to several months from now, but David will famously say in 2 Samuel 24, verse 24, I will not give to the Lord that which costs me nothing. We talk about sacrifice until we have to do it. It sounds really noble and spiritual to talk about sacrifice until you actually have to let go of something that maybe you didn't want to. Hannah was aware that her son would already belong to the Lord. She's saying, I want to dedicate him in a deeper way. Where do we fit into this? Because none of us has taken any Nazarite vows. I'm certainly not, because if I grow this out, I look like 65. So I'm not going there. But where do we fit in? How does it apply? Well, in a sense, we all belong to God. He is our maker. He created us and can do with us as he pleases. But as Christians, we are called to a further, deeper dedication and service to our God. God is already going to have his way, but if we allow him to have his way willingly, obediently through faith, there are promises made to us as well. Because he's our creator, he could ask anything of us that he wants. And he wouldn't have to give us anything in return, but he has chosen to pour out his love and his goodness and his affection upon us. How can we not pour out our lives in sacrificial service back to him? Now, last week we mentioned it is difficult, even impossible, to understand all of the reasons for God, the way God does things. The reasons and dynamics behind the plan of God are never going to fully be understood by us. And if that frustrates you, it should humble you rather than frustrate you. Isaiah 55, 8 and 9, my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. God is going to do an incredible work through the child that he will bless Hannah with. But God is using her current circumstances to bring her heart and mind to a place that is fully surrendered to the purposes of God. As we said earlier, trials, adversity, they have a tendency to bring us to our knees, both literally and figuratively. Certainly, this was not the first time Hannah prayed for a child, but perhaps this was the first time that her prayer got to this point, that she prayed like this, truly giving the child to the Lord, not just in her heart, but voicing it out as this vow. Prayer, if you've never heard me say this before, you're going to hear it today, and you'll probably hear it several times in our life together. Prayer is never about changing the mind of God. It's about finding it. It's not as though God was withholding a child for her until she said the magic words. No. As she's been praying for a child, God has been molding and shaping and breaking that heart to be the heart to accomplish His will and desire for the child. It's bigger than Hannah. It's bigger than you. It's even bigger than Samuel. Mature prayer takes us to the place where we can pray with this heart, the heart that the Lord demonstrated that we are to have. Luke 22:42, Father, if it is your will, take this cup away from me, Jesus said. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Such a beautiful prayer, and sometimes maybe you've prayed that prayer before. But then when it happens, you say, well, what happens? When He doesn't take the cup away. What is the cup Jesus is asking God to take away? Father, if it is your will, take this cup away from me. I don't want to be crucified. He knew what was going to happen to Him. And earthly, He's saying, I know what awaits, and I'm afraid. Why do you think His pores began to pour blood? That's how much anguish He had. It's a condition called hematidrosis. And so He's got blood coming out of His pores. He's so full of anxiety about what He's about to face. And He says, Father, if it's your will, take this cup away from me. If there's any other way, take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, we need to have that nevertheless that Jesus had. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. There's some cups that maybe God is asking you to drink today that are not pleasant, that are hard. But you have the promise of His presence in the midst of them. And there's a reason on the other end that He's asking you to drink of that cup that's bigger than you. And it's an honor to be a part of whatever God is doing on this side of heaven. God had plans of blessing this woman with an amazing and godly child. But it was through all that she endured that she became the mother He needed for her to be, to do with the child what needed to be done. When I think of difficult maternal times, I also think of Jesus' mother. At a very young age, she becomes pregnant even before she's wed. Her life was so scandalous from the outside observer. She knew how it happened, but who would believe her? She was called all kinds of awful things for the majority of her life. Her own betrothed didn't even believe her until God sent an angel to him one night to say, hey, she wasn't doing anything wrong. This is something I did, not something she did. She's been faithful. He says, don't leave the woman. Don't divorce the woman. Because back then, even an engagement would have required a divorce. And very few would believe her during her life and during the early life of the child. She'd walk around criticized and ostracized for this uncontrolled pregnancy sent to her from God. But she would be humble, understanding. She'd be obedient to God. She'd be the mother that God the Father needed for His incarnated Son. When God the Father would reveal to her that her baby was born to die, think about how difficult that was. I'm sure she had some prayers too. If there's any other way. Not that she had a choice in the matter. And He would tell her, it's time to let him go. She knew it was an honor. Mary knew. Hannah as well will be blessed and honored by giving her child back to God, the God who will give Samuel to her. Hannah goes to the tabernacle. She goes before the Lord. How'd the trip go? Well, one final point before we go on. God has not asked us to do anything He's not willing to do. There's not anything God is asking you to do today that He Himself has not already done. I love that about our God. The incarnation, Jesus coming to earth and enduring all the things that He did. Not only are there not anything that He's asking you to do that He hasn't done Himself, you will never outdo what He wound up having to do at the cross. in light of the cross being given to you, there's nothing God can ask of you that's too much. Nothing. God desired her heart to be in a place that said, "Here is my beloved Son." When God looked down at the earth, saw the great need we had, He said, "Here is my beloved Son." Now, back to Hannah. Hannah is praying, but she's not alone. There's a priest there, and he's watching, and he doesn't help at all. She's already down, and he unwittingly is going to kick her while she's down and throw sand in her eyes. I mean, it's just gross. Verse 12. And she was praying to the Lord. Eli watched her, seeing her lips moving but hearing no sound. He thought she'd been drinking. And he says, "Must you come here drunk?" he demanded. "Throw away your wine," he said. "Oh, no, sir," she replied. "I haven't been drinking wine or anything strong. I'm discouraged. I'm pouring out my heart to the Lord. Don't think I'm a wicked woman, for I've been praying out of great anguish and sorrow." "Oh, in that case," Eli said, "go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you the request you've asked of Him." "Oh, thank you, sir," she exclaimed. Then she went and began to eat again, and she was no longer sad. Way to go, Eli, right? As we go through the account of Samuel's life, you're going to find out today, I'm not a fan of Eli. To be frank with you, Eli is one of the most awful, infuriating figures, not only in this book, but in the Old Testament for me. As a pastor, I'm no priest, right? But as a pastor, kind of the New Testament equivalent, it breaks my heart when somebody misrepresents God in this way. This morning's study is a fitting introduction to this frustrating figure. A woman is there praying to herself, and he automatically assumes she's drunk. He assumes the worst of her in that moment. Now, trying to understand contextually, give him the benefit of the doubt here, it's a stretch. Prayers back then were often offered to God audibly. So perhaps her sitting there, it says that she's saying it inwardly, and she's kind of mouthing it along, but she's not voicing it outwardly, like was the custom. So Eli sees a woman whose mouth is moving, nothing's coming out. Therefore, he comes to this conclusion, she must be drunk. I'm trying really hard to give him the benefit of the doubt here. I'm still like, did you stretch before that reach, Eli? I told you, that's the jumping to conclusions I warned you about in our lengthy intro, right? Here's him jumping to conclusions. He sees this woman, she's crying, her mouth is moving, but nothing's coming out, and he's like, "Oh, you must be drunk." I don't understand. And if you're thinking I'm being too hard on him, again, look what he does next. He suspects something's off, right? So rather than discreetly pulling the woman aside and "Hey, is something wrong?" or "Have you been drinking?" Even that, ignorant but tasteful. No. Instead, what does he do? Calls her out publicly. He makes a bad conclusion. He jumps to a bad conclusion about this woman, and publicly he's like, "Must you come here drunk to the house of God? Throw away your wine, woman." My dad was made a public example of in a church when he was a young boy. And it wasn't until I got saved that he would come back to church. He's like 16 when it happens. And then I'm 17. He has a son. So we're talking decades outside of God's house because a pastor made an example of him in front of the congregation. He didn't even do anything wrong. Pastor just didn't like that his daughter had a crush on not the good boy. My dad wasn't a good boy. He didn't have a great reputation. He did some dumb things. His father killed himself when my dad was like 12. So my dad was rough around the edges, and the pastor's daughter had a crush on him. Pastor finds out, embarrasses him in front of everyone. And he doesn't return to church for decades. Now, I said last week we should never let men keep us from God, right? That when a man misrepresents God to us, we shouldn't let that get in the way of our relationship to God. But let's be honest, we're human. And especially when he was a young boy, after experiencing such great loss, having to carry your father's corpse out of the house to the hospital, that's traumatic. So when a pastor misrepresents God, it makes me angry. When this priest misrepresents God in this way, it makes me angry. And that's why he's one of my least favorite figures in the Bible. And it's only going to get worse the more you find out about him. As a priest, he's supposed to represent God. God is compassionate, full of grace and mercy and love and understanding. And Eli here is exhibiting none of these things. He's brash. He's lacking compassion. He's judgmental. Unfortunately, Eli is the caricature of religious people that the Washingtonians hate so much. Think about that. We're in a very godless place. Many people have rejected God here. You know a lot of them. I met a lot of them in my 3 years so far. And one of the reasons they hate God is because they met some Elis. Or Eli, the kind of person that Eli is who they imagine Christians to be. And we have the privilege of rightly representing our King to them. Now, we don't apologize for the truth, right? We know the Word reveals that the truth is going to offend people. We know that. We don't need to add, though, to being offensive ourselves. We're told in Ephesians 4:15 that we are to speak the truth in love. And sadly, sometimes we can be just like Eli, can't we? When someone's going on or when something is going on with someone, sometimes we have the tendency to jump to conclusions. Sometimes we might think the worst of that person. Now, it's easier to do in a larger church, but all of us have been to different churches in our walk with the Lord. And the bigger it gets, the easier it gets to become very judgmental. It's why people often hesitate to ask for prayer. They're worried about what others are going to think of them. They're worried about being judged. Part of this comes from we know how many times we've judged. So we're projecting onto others. We become afraid to ask for prayer because we've judged and we're worried they're going to judge us. So what does it do? We are missing out on the blessing that the book of James gives us. And that is to confess one to another, praying for one another. When you see somebody going up for prayer in the future, because obviously I haven't done altar calls, it's too small, and I know you guys. Right? Does anyone want to receive the Lord today? It'd be kind of overkill to do an altar call here. Not that as I get to know you guys, I'm not doubting anyone's salvation. Let's just put it that way, okay? So an altar call is not something, not that I'll never do them, but I don't feel led to do them now because I know the people who I'm dealing with. But as we grow and God brings people, if somebody goes up for prayer, sometimes we begin thinking, I wonder what they did. Right? We do that. And if you've ever been to a big church, you might have felt that way too. You're like, I don't want to go up for prayer because pastor's message was about X. And if I go up for prayer, they're going to think I need prayer for X. Right? So you stay there. And you don't go up for prayer. I've been there too. Man, pastor's message was about sexual immorality. I need prayer about this other circumstance that I'm going through. But if I go up, they're going to think I'm going up because of sexual immorality. So I'm not going up. I've reasoned that. I've done that. And you probably have too. Because we know that there are other people in the congregation. And then you put a title on it, it makes that barrier even wider because there are times in which I have felt like I have nowhere to turn. Because, well, if I'm too vulnerable, then they're not going to want to follow me because they're going to see me as weak. That's what the enemy says. So Eli, he has no idea why this woman is there crying, but he assumes the worst about her, and he's supposed to be a representative of God. On another note of the same chord, my old pastor used to say, people are the way they are for a reason. So even if someone is exhibiting negative behaviors, they may be hiding hurt. There may be hidden hurt that's causing them to think the way that they do and to be doing the things that they're doing. And even if there is no good reason for their behavior, you won't know unless you talk to them. Don't be like Eli. He saw someone acting strangely in church. They're acting strangely because they're hurting, but he didn't know what the behavior was being caused by, that it was the result of deep sadness. And he never would have found out if it wasn't for the patience and kindness of Hannah. Maybe you feel like Hannah today. Hannah is surrounded by people that don't understand her. Her husband doesn't understand her. Well, why are you crying? You got me, babe. Pastor doesn't understand her. Her priest doesn't understand her, right? Eli sees her praying and shouts, "Must you come here drunk, woman? Throw away your wine." Poor Hannah. But there's something about this situation that makes it even worse. You saw how quick he was to assume the worst about her. Those of you that know what's going on with Eli, oh man, I don't like this guy. He was so quick to publicly shame her. What about your kids, my beloved said, right? He didn't even know if she had done anything wrong. He didn't even know if she had done the thing he accused her of doing. But when you meet his sons in the next chapter, it makes all of this even worse. I'm going to spoil it. I'm going to tell you a little bit about his dirtbag kids. His sons are adults, so I'm not insulting children. His sons are adults, and they are horrible individuals. Women come to the temple to make their offerings and confessions before God, and they're having sex with those women. They are, in the offerings that are meant to be for the Lord, the fat is supposed to be for the Lord. The fat is for the Lord. I'm sorry, different fat. But the fat portion of the offering was supposed to be for the Lord. They're going up while it's still cooking, and they're taking it out for themselves. This is a huge deal. Remember, God killed a guy for just touching the ark one time. So this is not a small matter. And everybody knew. Everybody knew that these guys were crooked. Eli is guilty of apocalyptic levels of hypocrisy. His sons will be guilty of the bad behavior and worse that he's accusing Hannah of. And do you think he says, "Must you come here drunk, away with your wine," to his sons? No, he doesn't. He never does. He knows what they're doing, and he does nothing about it. And he will pay dearly for this injustice and this hypocrisy and inconsistency. Beloved, we absolutely destroy our witness when we are guilty of the things that we condemn in others. I'm not saying you must be perfect. I'm saying that we must be seeking holiness in our lives before we go around trying to speck hunt in others. When we judge one person and their sin a certain way, but then turn around and give someone else who's doing the same stuff a pass. That's why Jesus taught to remove, again, the plank from your eye before trying to remove the speck from another. Matthew 7, 3-5, he talks about this. Here's an infamous example of modern church culture that I'll give you. As Christians, faithful to the Word of God, we do condemn homosexual lifestyles, right? And many are still doing that, fewer and fewer it seems, but there are those that take a clear stance against that particular sin, and they call it out and they condemn it, as they should, as my wife said. I have no problem with that. But what I do have a problem with is many of those same churches will do nothing about those within their congregations, the heterosexual couples that are living together and are having sex. You do nothing. You say nothing about that. If we want to be taken seriously, we must deal with sin consistently, especially when those sins fall in the same category. I have had people throw shade at the church, capital C church, for saying, y'all are inconsistent. And I say, you're right, and they're wrong for doing that. But I'm not like that. See, this has cost me personally. This has cost me greatly, but I want to have integrity, and I want to protect my witness, our witness as a church. I will not be accused of that hypocrisy and that inconsistency. So I'm going to treat somebody who comes in who is unmarried, claiming to be a Christian, I'm going to handle that the same way as if somebody were to come in saying, hey, I want to be a Christian, but I'm engaged in a homosexual lifestyle. I say, well, this is what you got to do. To that other couple, I'm say, this is what you got to do. We got to be consistent, right? It's also considered a more obvious offense and overlooking sin in those we love. It's way easy to condemn some random woman, right? This random woman came into the temple, a sin she's not even committing, by the way. But here's some random woman, and he's like, are you drunk? Get out of here, right? But his sons get a pass. He's downplaying in his mind that what they're doing, which is even worse, he downplays it, and he accepts it. I've seen people say they agree with God's righteous standard, but then when it's their family member that's guilty of doing the thing that God hates, suddenly they're asking the same satanic question from the garden. Well, did God really say? Why is it less true? Because it's your son or daughter doing it. I have not come to blows physically, but I have butt heads with families before who 6 months before were saying, oh yeah, that's wrong, but then one of their children suddenly is doing it, and they're like, but maybe. Stop it. There's this Michael Jordan, just stop it, get some help. It's like, stop lying to yourself. Just because it's someone you love doesn't mean they get a pass, that it's less sinful. And if you make exceptions for your loved ones, if you overlook their sin, but want to go condemn it in others, you will rightfully be called a hypocrite. When we show partiality in this way, we lose the moral high ground and we dishonor God. Now, back to Hannah as we prepare to wrap up. How does she respond to his misplaced accusation? She's going to handle this situation so gracefully, just like she handled the first one with her husband saying stupid stuff. And he says, must you come here drunk? Throw your wine away. She goes, oh no, sir. I haven't been drinking. I'm discouraged. I'm pouring out my heart to God. I'm not a wicked woman. I've been praying. I got great anguish. I got great sorrow. And then she didn't snap at him in anger like we might be tempted to do. Even though someone was falsely accusing her of something awful. Jesus was falsely accused of being a drunkard and a glutton as well. Neither were true, and he didn't snap either. Sometimes we're accused falsely of things, and we have to handle those gracefully. She explains her behavior is not the result of strong drink. She says, I'm coming this way as a result of great sorrow, not great drink. So please don't think I'm a wicked woman. She handled the situation with what her remember Hannah translates to grace? That's how she lived her life. We can learn a lot from Hannah's example. We need to show a little more grace to people around us, even when they say dumb stuff to us without thinking, starting at home. Love believes all things. My wife does this better than I do. Love believes the best. Doesn't mean you check your brain at the door. Doesn't mean you ignore things that you clearly see later on, but believe the best up front. Hannah didn't snap. She didn't retaliate on Eli, although she could have. The reputation of his sons was well known. When Eli accused her, she didn't say, oh, you call me a drunk? Oh, what about what your sons be doing? She didn't do that. This was not the time or place for that. She's still addressing the high priest. Though he and his sons behaved wickedly, Hannah didn't let them bring her down to their level. She also didn't say, well, he said something mean and dumb to me, so I'm leaving the tabernacle and never coming back. I'm going to leave the church and never come back, right? Because somebody said something mean to me. That was a point that we made from our last study. There are many who will leave the church, even leave the faith, saying, well, the pastor said something mean to me, I'm leaving, or so-and-so said something mean about me, so I'm leaving. It's childish. Childish. You have to try to fix it, and if it can't be fixed, well, then you cross that bridge when you get there. But we've all been guilty at some point or another of saying something dumb to someone, right? You ever accidentally hurt somebody's feelings, or even purposely hurt someone's feelings? I've done both. We've all unknowingly said something or have done something, and we hurt someone. When you did it, when you were the guilty one, you asked them for what? Grace. Mercy, right? Oh, forgive me, right? I'm so sorry. Or why do we insist that everyone must forgive us? Cut us some slack when it's us, but then not do it for others. That's why Jesus stressed, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. When we're guilty, we want grace. When we're the victim, we want justice. Proverbs talks about having unequal scales. That's what we have sometimes. We have all erred in this area. And we all need to be a little more gracious like Hannah. Again, to reiterate, even if a pastor or someone in leadership at a church says something that offends you, they're human too. I'm human. Show them Hannah. Show them grace. One final point for those who walk away, one that bears pointing out, no one can ever say, I left God because so-and-so at the church offended me, so I didn't want to be a Christian anymore. That excuse will not hold water when you're standing before God. Because he didn't tell you to go look at others. He said, look to my son. And to those people, I've even said to some of them, you didn't really want to be a Christian. You were just looking for a reason to walk away, and they gave you one. Hannah was treated poorly by someone in the church, but she knew he was but a man. She wasn't there for a man. She was there to make a petition to the Lord of hosts. And that petition was asking the Lord of heaven's armies for a son. And in that interaction, she says, hey, I'm not a wicked woman. I'm actually asking God for this. Well, actually, she doesn't even explain to him. She says, I'm making a petition to God. He says, in that case, he's embarrassed because he just put his foot in his mouth. In that case, go in peace. May the God of Israel grant you the request that you asked. And she's like, cool, thank you, sir. And she went back and began to eat. And she was no longer sad. He realized he was rash, he was judgmental. Awkwardly says, oh, then I hope God gives you what you asked for. After laying her burden down at the feet of the Lord, we're told she's able to eat. And that her sadness had lifted. Anytime you go before the Lord with your burdens and truly lay them at his feet, this is what you can find. This is the peace that you can find. Now, you might have to come a few times a day. And that's okay. But we got to be quick to run to him with these things, or they'll destroy us. You can go back to eating, meaning you can return to business as usual if you make it a point to bring those pains to the Lord. You're able to start living again, because even though you may still be in pain, you might still be in that hurtful situation, reminding your heart and mind to continually go before the Lord will give you the faith and the peace that your Father in heaven wants you to have. The peace of knowing he heard your cry. And he's with you in the midst of that pain. And that it's for his glory and for your good. Hannah had this kind of faith and confidence in the Lord. She was able to return to business as usual with a smile once again. Not because she was pretending as though she didn't hurt anymore. I'm not asking you to pretend. I'm asking you to do like she did and really hand it over. I can't carry this, God. It's too big for me. I'm going to hand it over to you. I'm going to lay it at the feet of the cross and let you pick it up. And if we'll do that, I want that last verse to be true for you today, where it says that she was no longer sad. I want you to be able to leave here with joy today, with some peace today.